Alright guys, so the time has come for some rendering of our scenes. I have prepared just this, I have this animation going in here. I'm not going to render out all of this because it's a little bit extreme, but this is like the first attack in this little combo I got, and my camera is already in my scene. You can see how to make cameras in the other video, and you'll see that it kind of follows the action. So what we need to do now is, render out a more appealing image for this, because if you're going to present it in a portfolio or something, people are going to want to see a more final image. Some quick information about this is this bottom panel. You'll notice that it looks a little bit different. It's because you probably don't have film gate enabled on your one at home, so you can turn it on there, and this basically shows what the computer is going to render out in its final product. You'll also notice that if you go up to here, you might be on a different tab, such as modeling, creating your animation. What we're going to be using for this is rendering, right here. So you'll see that your options have changed up here, and the most notable is going to be render, and you can access render settings. You can also go click on this little gear to access render settings, and this Arnold tab. And what we're going to do is, first we're going to pop open render settings. You'll switch over to common. First step is it'll probably reset itself, or you'll be using new settings if this is the first time you're opening up the render settings. What we want to switch over, because it defaults to Maya software, I believe, when you open up a new the new render tab on a new terminal, like a new computer entirely. So what we need to do is switch over to Arnold. Arnold is a different piece of rendering software within Maya that we're going to be using to render out our scenes. So I'm going to leave these default settings pretty intact, but some that I change are image format. I believe it defaults to JPEG, and for a final render, JPEGs are a lossy image type. You're going to lose information each time you save out a JPEG. What we want to use instead is a PNG. This will give us access as well to an alpha channel that you could use for some sort of compositing stuff. And I believe it comes defaulted as frame animation extension here. These settings are very important because this is going to determine if you're rendering out an animation or a still frame. Note how in the parentheses it says single frame. We don't want that. We want a stream of images, because we need to render from 1 to 40. I'm probably only going to do like 1 to 10. And here you'll notice that it gives you a bunch of different options for how it's going to save out the file name. So the one I like is name, in other words the name of the file, and then frame number. So it's going to start with 001, and then when it goes to the next one, it's going to render out the scene name 002, 003, 004, and so on like that. So I'm going to use that. And start frame, I'm going to set to 1. End frame, I'm going to set to 10 just because I don't want to spend all your guys' time rendering out a bunch of frames. Renderable camera. Now, it defaults to perspective, which is what I have in here, but I set up this camera to render, and you'll see it's camera 1. So what we need to do instead is you render using that camera. Now, if I go to this drag down and just set it right there, it's going to automatically render from that camera. Image size, you're going to want 1080 for your final film. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to bump it down to 720 just so when we're doing our preview renders, it doesn't take forever again. You might want to work even at 540 if your computer's super slow, and then bump it up to 1080 for the final render. However, I'm going to keep it at 720 just for this demonstration. And then everything else is this is some custom mel scripting stuff. Now, here are some additional options only for Arnold. There's a bunch in here. Like, you got some motion blur, so if things move really quick through the scene, they're gonna smear. You get some other, this is basically like a background type setting. Oh yeah, it even says here, background legacy. It apparently wants you to use atmosphere now, but however, we're not going to be using that. I'm going to show you some different options for that. Ray depth, this has to do with how the rays bounce through the scene. And this is some filter methods. However, these top ones are critically important, I believe, for fidelity. So if you render out an image currently with camera anti-aliasing right here, it's going to be it's going to look very spotty. We'll look at that in a little bit, but in the final render, you're going to want to crank up these settings to like pretty much their max. We don't want to be too free with it right now though, because that takes a lot of time. That adds on a lot of time to the render. So that's pretty much fine for that. So without further ado, let's pop open our little renderer preview. So I like to go up here, Arnold, open Arnold render view, and you'll see up here there's a play button, and that's going to enable the render of the scene. What we want to do though is switch this over to camera shape 1, because that's the camera we're rendering from. And if you can hear in the background, my computer is struggling right now. Hopefully capturing and doing some renders doesn't make my computer explode. And nothing happened. So you might be like, oh, this thing's broken. What's going on? Well, the thing is that you probably haven't lit your scene at all. And you can see that it was in fact rendering something. If you turn on alpha, this is alpha right up here. And this is also why we use PNGs, is because then you can save this out and you'd have an alpha channel that you, in your video editing software, you could just plop an image in the background and do whatever you like with it. So it gives you nice little options there. However, I'm going to leave that off for now because we're going to actually see the image. Now, in order to get some lights into the scene, we need to go over the lights tab. And I'm going to cover a couple of these. Alright, so we got physical sky first, so I'm going to enable that. And you'll see automatically it's starting to render out an image that is of higher fidelity than we've ever really seen before. And what we need to do now is we're going to zoom out. Based on how large your scene is, this might come in too small or too large, so I'm going to scale this up. Just move it out there. I'm going to actually set it to, let's do like 10 or something. Boom. So that's pretty far out there now. And you might be wondering, like, oh man, this is pretty sick. I might want to use this for rendering my project. Here's how you get more control over it though. So clicking on there, you'll get attribute editor. And then you'll have a bunch of different options in here just by default. I'm not gonna be able to get to all of these because there's a lot of them. Whoops. And one main one to think about though is camera right here, invisibility. Oh, my computer is thinking really hard. So I dragged that all the way down. Notice how there's none of that gradient that you saw in the background before, but all the lighting is still the same. So you could potentially render that out, then you have your alpha layer, and then be able to just superimpose an image on that. I'm going to leave it on for now because it's good for visualizing. Sorry about clearing my throat a bunch. And if you go up to the top here in the options, oh man, whew, let's make my computer chug. So I'm going to stop that for now so it doesn't automatically chug no matter what I do. Now, if you missed what I did right there, I went to the color channel at the top of this, and I went to this little connection there. And you'll see that it has a bunch of different options in here. Now I'm gonna re-enable it, and you'll see based on how I drag these, this is elevation. This is basically how high the sun is in the sky. So notice how this looks more like a early morning, like you just woke up at the crack of dawn, and this is like afternoon type, like sun is high in the sky. That's elevation. Azimuth is how like the rotation of where that sun is right there. And it's kind of hard to see with this grainy rendering, but you can see how this light is now working around my model, and it's pretty nice. Intensity is what you would think. It just gets stronger. Oh, 1 second. I can just make it look like everything's about to get sunburnt as heck. But yeah, so this is how you get some control over what you're doing. Turbidity is basically controls this gradient in the background, makes it look more hazy. I've found the higher you crank it up, and it affects the lighting as such. I'm going to leave that around 3 though. Now, if I adjust ground albedo, you'll notice that it gets it kind of lightens the albedo or color of the sky in the background, that gradient. So if you want to affect how that looks, then that's the channel you would use. You can also apply crazy colors to. Ooh, okay. Maya's thinking. 1 second. You can adjust the tint of this. So if you want a really red sky, and then it'll just get wacky real quick, you know. So yeah, there's a bunch of options here to play with, and feel free to experiment, learn on your own. Sun tint, you can also change this bad boy. That now. Yeah, so there's a bunch of options. Enable sun is just going to turn on and off the sun in the scene, and it'll just light it with the ambient sort of bouncing of light off of this dome, rather than having a sort of sun that's pointing on your scene right there. So yeah, feel free to experiment with that. That is completely fine. There is another method very similar to this. I'm going to delete that dome from the scene. You'll notice the renderer is like, yo, there's nothing even lighting the scene anymore. So if you go to Sky Dome Light, you'll notice that it just comes in as bright as possible. And if we go into the attributes for this, you'll see that there is now, it's very similar to that physical sky. All these are the same settings. However, that color channel is not linked to anything. Where it was linked to the physical sky before, we can now put a file. So if I go to, oh, it's loading, please. If I go in and select an image, I downloaded some HDR skies off, where is it? I use this place, HDRI Haven. It's pretty nice. And it has a bunch of different different sky presets, and so you can feel free to browse around here, grab some off here, and then slap them in your scene. You'll be able to see what it looks like here. So I'm going to use this one. Let's open that bad boy up. So now it's doing a very similar thing that the physical sky was doing, but it's using an image now instead. And with that alpha channel, you could then composite and remove this image. Let's see, 1 second here. If I go back to the camera, crank that down, you get that image, but you don't have that lighting in the background. Or you get the lighting of the scene, but you don't have that image in the background that you can like superimpose your own one in there. So it's pretty nice. There's some other light that you can use to light your scene up. So I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to go over my create menu, and I'm going to create a directional light. And you'll see it's thinking. Directional lights, and notice it doesn't change the lighting based on where that light is. It doesn't change based on scale either, if Maya doesn't lock itself down. So you'll see it's just a bunch of arrows pointing. And you can, Maya will allow, rotate your light in your scene. And you'll see that that's reflected in the render as well. So this is another method of lighting your scene, and you can adjust like the color temperature of it and all that stuff as well. And there's also and you can adjust the color temperature, and you can toggle on if it's going to even make shadows in your scene or not. It probably should. You can also adjust how, well, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but how dense those shadows are. Notice how they kind of gradate off, which is pretty nice. And you can also go in to the color of it itself, much like the sun, and just kind of make it anything that you'd like. And you can adjust how much that's blasting your scene. I'm going to leave this to be very dull though. And there's some other lights. So think if you had say some sort of light bulb in your room that's emitting light from a singular point. And you can see it's barely showing up right there right now. So I'm going to go into the options on that instead. And I'm gonna crank up exposure a little bit. Let's see how it starts looking. I'm gonna be careful with exposure because that can get real wild real quick. And radius, if you crank this up, imagine you're just increasing the size of a sphere that's emitting light. If I move this up here, you can see that it's kind of on the breastplate now. And let's type in a value a little bit past. Let's do 10. So you can see how that's looking in the scene now. And so you can place these in your scene and increase their size and all that. However, keep in mind that scaling, if I press R, doesn't let me do anything. Doesn't do anything to the light. So keep that in mind when you're working around with this, because it's pretty much only translation that's important for point lights. I'm going to delete that from the scene. If you like, you could also create a sphere. And then, sorry, mine's going a little bit slow because it's rendering out all this stuff and I got the capture going on. I'm going to scale this up. I'm going to pause this render view so I can actually work in Maya. So I'm going to scale this up, and I'm going to assign a new material to it. I'm going to use one of the Arnold shaders this time. I'm going to use standard right there. And we're looking for something called emission. And emission is how bright, like how much light it's putting off. And you'll be able to see it now in the renderer. So now in your scene you have this sort of glowing orb, but it's not producing any actual light. So what you can do is go to Arnold, lights, because these are all the lights that come with Arnold, and the ones that it's able to process and are made with its own methods. However, these ones are some legacy lights that are made with Maya. In here, lights, do mesh light, you'll notice that it disappears. Now that it's enabled as a light, you can go into the attribute editor of it, and you can adjust the intensity and the exposure of it to get it to what exactly you need it to be. You can also make it visible, so that mesh that was there before, which has the emission shader, which makes it look like it's glowing, can be enabled. And then if we go into exposure, just like the point light, we can crank up the exposure of it, and you can see the effect that we're getting on there now. So you're free to light your scene with whatever you think is going to give you the best results. It is a pretty fun part of the process because you get to see the final images of your product. But now the question is, how do we get these images out? So I'm going to go back to that physical sky because it has some really nice settings on there. Ooh, look at this. Get some spooky lighting in there. I'm going to delete that light from the scene. So now I have 0 lights in the scene, and I'm going to delete this orb as well. You can see that its emission just by itself was adding some light to the scene. And I'm going to remove that. Boom. And I'm going to go back and create that physical sky. Boom. So say we wanted to render a sequence now, right? So your shot, your first shot lasts 10 frames, right? So you'll see he's moving around in there, doing the animation. Now what we need to do is render those as a sequence, and then export those images as they're rendered out to a directory. Now, normally you would do batch render, and since you already set in your render settings over here, the start frame is 1, end frame is 10, say that's your shot, boom, bang, camera 1, HD right there, you get all those in line, right? If you instead go to batch render, since you're using Arnold, it's going to put an Arnold brand over like the image, like a watermark. So what we need to do instead is use render sequence, and you're gonna go to these little option boxes right here, and it's gonna pop up. It's gonna say current camera, so you're gonna set that to the camera that you're gonna be rendering out, and then you're gonna do none of these options. Render region means that it's going to render a smaller part of the frame. We don't want that. I'm not sure exactly what ignore local overrides is. That seems to be a newer option. All renderable, render enabled layers. So you can turn off, you can sort your scene by different render layers. So you can render different, you can get different effects from that. Same with cameras. We don't want, since we're only rendering from one camera, we don't want to get all of them in there. And we're going to place this in alternate output file location. We're going to make this be, you can see I did a trial run of this. We're going to make this be the directory for it. And then you're going to have some options down here. And you're going to have all those enabled because you want to have all those be renderable, you know. So I'm going to render sequence and close. It's going to take some time. And you'll see that it's adding each image into this folder as it's rendering. So I find it's best to kind of not mess with your computer while you're doing this, because it's very susceptible to crashing because it's doing a lot of processing right now. So you're going to be careful with that. And I'll just cut forward at this point. Michael, edit out this dialogue, please, 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 please. Oh man, if only they knew how dumb I am. The type of man that says please. And here we go. So we got our sequence rendered out, and it's ready to slap into whatever compositing software you got, like Adobe Premiere or After Effects, whatever it may be. You can just line those up now and then string them together, add some sound onto it, and you'll be good to go. So you can also see that if you zoom in on here, like you'll see it's pretty grainy. And remember, if that's happening in the settings, you'll crank this up very high. It will, however, add a considerable amount of time to the render. So keep in mind how much time you have to render. Rendering takes the computer a long time. Thankfully, you don't have to think of how every pixel looks when you're lighting it, you know? That's what the computer handles. So, yeah, just keep track of that. And yeah, I would increase a lot of these sliders too for the final render. But yeah, so that's pretty much lighting and rendering out a sequence. And yep, thanks for watching.